Well, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I say good afternoon because I've got some colleagues all the way from New Zealand who've joined us on the webcast. And welcome to DataZoom's Leadership, Wisdom and Insight series. I'll be speaking with leaders across sectors about their journeys, what makes them tick, what the future holds, and what they think the next wave of disruption looks like. Bringing together leaders from the areas of data and analytics, the Internet of Things, blockchain, artificial intelligence, and other areas. As you know, my name is Samir Sharma, and I'll be hosting this meeting this morning. So I hope you're sitting comfortably and whatever beverage of your choice you have. If it's the morning, then possibly coffee. If it's the evening, probably a beer. And today my guest is the fantastic Raymond Mahlangu. Raymond is currently the Chief Data Officer for Alexander Forbes. And good morning, Raymond, and welcome. Pleasure to have you here. Thankfully, we've got you on. So I just love if you could say good morning to everybody.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks to you, Samir, for actually giving me the privilege of being part of this, this series of leadership and insight sessions.
That's a pleasure. That's a pleasure. I just before we launch into our discussion, Raymond, just a few things in terms of logistics. Raymond and I will probably be talking for about 40 minutes, and then for those who attended last time, there's a chat area, so you can type away and send me your questions. And at the end of the session, I will basically ask those questions to Raymond, and we can get on with the session now. So this is being recorded and it will be played back for you. So as you can see, Raymond is the Chief Data Officer, Group Chief Data Officer for Alexander Forbes. Raymond, tell me a little bit about your work at Alexander Forbes and what you're currently up to.
I think firstly, I'm the first generation, I think, Chief Data Officer for the group. Mm-hmm. And when I joined, it was actually greenfield. Basically, I had to define the role myself because obviously this role across, I think, different industries is not well defined. Everybody has a perception, but I think I had the privilege of actually joining the organization, understanding the challenges, and then building around what people had sort of like, given as a framework around that. And then I think that actually helped me a lot to then, say this is what is required of a Chief Data Officer within Alexander Forbes. That was the beginning of the journey. And as expected, one has to look at the foundational, sort of like components in place first. Are we well positioned to be able to manage our data? Are we able to actually, leverage off our data as an asset and monetize? And I think all those things come from actually, first of all, understanding your own environment and its own maturity, as well as the sort of expectation that they would want from a CDO.
Sure. So in that vein, tell me, because obviously being a first-generation Chief Data Officer, that's quite a big mantle to take and responsibility. What's your journey been? How did you come to this point? Because Alexander Forbes is a Pan-African insurer and investment company. And if I've said that wrong, then please do correct me. But I believe that you were worldwide at one point, but you've started to consolidate positions across the world and are focusing on Africa. So tell me a bit about how you came to this point of first generation and what your journey's been.
I think firstly, like I said, let's start from the appointment letter. You go from excitement to what have I just done to myself? But I think it was exciting in the sense that, when you join the organization, I was faced with a mammoth of a task to first of all understand, what are the challenges of the organization. Obviously, bearing in mind where is the organization going, and you see how you fit yourself in there as a Chief Data Officer by first of all collecting and understanding the data assets across the group. and consolidating them in a way where you can actually now be able to dissect and distribute in accordance of what the business needs are to support the corporate strategy. So that was my approach. So saying that, there's an expectation, obviously, that nobody understands what the role is about or what the scope is. So everybody expects you to solve every problem that's got to do with data. So you've got to actually take a roadmap and be clear in terms of what are you going to focus on and ensure that it's aligned to the business objectives, obviously. And then take the organization on a journey and educate as you go along, because I think if you've got a good understanding of what it is you want to achieve and what your expectation is from business to help you to achieve that goal, it actually lessens the pressure of you solving everything.
So on that vein, what if, as a first generation officer, I mean, particularly in a country where, in a continent where connectivity, infrastructure, and certain parts of technology have gone beyond other continents, but and things like M-Pesa and payments, etc., have leapfrogged some of the Western countries. But in your view as a chief data officer, specifically working in this area, what have the challenges been for you, even coming into Alexander Forbes and sort of looking at the landscape and saying, right, well, data, okay, so you've got this data, you've been accumulating it, but perhaps maybe the systems haven't been in place, the technology sort of has been a bit lax, or the governance around it. So what were you first presented with that made you think, wow, this is quite a mammoth task in terms of me as a chief data officer, but as that first generation, because I find the first generation is very much about education, very much about trying to work through some of the issues and trying to get people on the same page. So I don't know how it was for you when you first joined, and your first kind of gut feeling or instincts around your role.
I think firstly, if you, with me joining Alexander Forbes, fortunately enough, from a technology point of view, I think South Africa is very well positioned, because I mean there's a lot of, I think, very innovative initiatives that are going around. So we are well positioned from a technology point of view. But it also differs from company to company. In my specific situation, when I joined, I was faced with a realization of saying, okay, look, we're not, in terms maybe of maturity, where we want to be in alignment with where we're going. But there is governance that's in place. It was just a question of saying, let's now relook, given that now there's a lot of data, around, how do we best position ourselves as an organization to now leverage off these fourth industrial revolution technologies that are coming up, and to ensure that we support, the business imperatives that are being driven, some to drive revenue, some to increase customer experience, get customer insight. So that was I think my position when I joined. It was not a question of, we're very far behind, but it's more of a question of, let's now zone into the data area, get a focused person who's going to now collate this asset and then provision across the group to support the business initiatives that are actually going on.
Sure. So, so it's an interesting fact. And I understand that South Africa is probably far ahead than other sub-Saharan. So I get that point. And in terms of the steer from the CEO, what's changed in the landscape of Alexander Forbes, and why has there been a bigger view on data, in particular to have a group chief data officer and to have the people around you? What's been the driver from the CEO?
I think from my view is, if you're going to drive any value, it's going to come from data, because data is what will actually generate that value through innovative use of the data. So I think from that perspective, there was a realization that we actually need to focus and invest and ensure that, we actually, utilize it as an asset. So being with that understanding, obviously there is the need to invest in it. That's where he kindly came in to say, okay, look, you know what, we understand, it's supportive, and everybody's on board in terms of where we want to go with data.
Sure. How much have you had to work with your departmental colleagues, your C-suite colleagues? How much have you had to educate the board? What have been the challenges specifically in areas of chief data officer? I often hear that there's a lot of upward managing rather than the downwards at the beginning. But what's been the challenges for you, and what do you see as those opportunities you start to look across the African market, as you start to focus? Because I think very much the drive for Alexander Forbes is to go pan-African and build the top insurance company and investment company in Africa. So firstly, what have been those challenges or the opportunities that you've seen that have existed in that sphere upwards at the board and at the C-suite level for you?
I think firstly, the biggest challenge is, there's insufficient resources, being, I think maybe provisioned for chief data officers. I mean, I'm talking about, generally. And despite that title that, okay, you are C-suite level, but sometimes I think lack of authority to get that job done can result in, being a major impediment in terms of your delivery. And also, I think the biggest one is if you look at the misconception about that role. There's a tendency, I think, to most probably align it to governance, data stewardship, those sort of things, and policies. And I think it goes beyond that. It's more of a striking balance between control versus, growth.
Yes.
So I think it depends on where you are in the journey. Like in my instance, I had to focus on the governance, focus on data stewardship, and policy and, all that information security. Because without those foundational artifacts in place, I think you're going to find yourself in a very difficult position. But it transitions. So you've got to actually have a clear roadmap to say, while if the focus is on this, there's got to be a clear balance in terms of, but where to from here? Am I now well positioned for growth? And by growth, I'm inferring to things like your analytics, generating insights based on good foundational, sort of like solid foundation.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've come from that governance aspect. I think I can understand, because in the sort of financial area, that's obviously the biggest area in terms of data and security and regulation, because that's obviously got to be the first area that you would attack as a chief data officer, to make sure that your data's in the suitable format, you've got the right quality, but also you're achieving those regulatory reports and so on. So it sounds like you've got that in place. And it quite clearly earlier on, you said you've got to start underpinning the organizational strategic objectives. So take me through some of those and what they are, and where you see the opportunities for you to drive that through data, to drive that through analytics, but to help the business grow. Where do you feel you have those opportunities ahead of you?
I think given that, there's a good foundation, I think the first thing is I believe that a chief data officer has got to be a very innovative thinker. You're almost like a chef, to not actually say you've got ingredients now. So how are you going to create different menus out of that? And, and which audience is going to be, positioned for which dish and whatnot. So by that I mean, if you look at a business generally, you've got different clusters per se. You can have a cluster that deals with claims. You can have a cluster that deals, onboarding. So you now look at the processes within the organization and try and understand what are the processes that are actually, what are the challenges or that we need to sort of resolve based on the data we have and the processes to improve our efficiency, to either generate revenue or to do things in a faster and a quicker way. So the opportunities that we see is, we have a lot of digital disruption, which means our customers now engage, digitally. So you've got to look at your data asset, you've got to look at your processes, you've got to look at your, the sort of technology that you're going to invest in to say, are we positioned, given that now we have the foundation, what is the next step? So my view is now looking at growth now. There's artificial intelligence, which I believe plays a big role, in the insurance industry. So that's a place where you can actually start to say, how can I now infuse component of digital and a component of, artificial intelligence to now drive that value.
And there's a point there around digital. It's obviously digital transformation is probably one of the biggest buzzwords, that surpassed big data at the moment. Thankfully, I never really liked big data as a term. I don't like digital transformation as a term either, because we're all being digitally transformed all the time. But on that vein, you're the CDO, the chief, data officer, and then you have these other C-suite colleagues like the chief digital officer or the CIO. What's the combination, or what's the way that you've been able to sync with the CTO or the CIO to ensure that you as the CDO are carefully walking with them and to ensure that you've all carved up your roles and responsibilities in the right way? How have you played that? Because some other companies and some other CDOs that I've spoken to often clash with the chief digital officer because there's such a huge component of data there naturally. So how have you overcome those? Perhaps you haven't had any of those challenges. Perhaps you don't have a chief digital officer, but how have you sort of managed that?
I think, like in our instance, we do have a chief digital, role that actually is responsible for that. We do have a CIO, but I think I think it's more about collaboration, because I believe if you're a CDO, remember this is a new role, so you're trying to find a home and you're trying to fit yourself into an already existing structure. So the first thing that I would do is firstly to look at what are the things that are already in place, that can work to your advantage. And you find maybe collaborative efforts in that manner, because then you can set clear boundaries in terms of where accountability for certain, responsibilities lie, and also understanding that you're there to help one another and to collaborate. So as a chief data officer, you're more the collaborator, bringing different stakeholders to actually work towards a common goal, which is obviously let's utilize our data. But you cannot have data where there is no technology, infrastructure. You've got to find the connection and the collaborative link between those.
And that's interesting, because I actually do think, I was speaking to the head of data architecture and analytics for a very large council in the UK yesterday, and I believe that digital transformation is about implementing and digitizing processes and implementing new systems, getting closer to the customer. But at the heart of it, data is the essence of what we will be generating from all of those systems. So I like the idea that actually, you're probably the glue that brings together a lot of the other people who are putting in the technology platform, who are understanding the customer experiences and mapping that customer journey. But it sounds like you're very much embedded in working together, which is wonderful to hear. In that vein, what and it's this next question that sort of comes up is, what are the professional skills that you've needed as a CDO? And I think this goes back to a question that we had in my previous webcast around what's the education path? Is there an education path? Does there need to be one? If there isn't, is there anything? How did you come up to, in the ranks, and what's your experience, your professional experience?
I think, Samir, I've been very fortunate that I've actually come from, from ground zero, working from my way up from being a database administrator, being a programmer. I've been an architect. I mean, I've played all the roles that you can think of that actually enabled me to have a good, solid foundation in terms of technological understanding. So that for me is a key component, because why? If I'm to engage with the technical resources to try and relay a business requirement, I've got to understand in their terms what they mean and then translate that into a business need and know that the bridge between those two, technical and business, I think there's a language barrier there. So with a good understanding of technology, it's easier to translate. That's the first thing. And I think also shaping your strategic thinking in terms of what is it that you're trying to achieve. You know, there's a lack of capabilities and competencies around the culture of data, in my view, because the buzz around data, well, I mean, it's still fairly new, if you ask me, in terms of organizations coming to the realization that we need to pay more attention to the data. So that strategic thinking component, backed up by a good technological understanding and business experience and leadership, I think is a good combination, in my view, that can actually now give you that capability to communicate in terms of what is the roadmap, what we're trying to achieve.
And I think you're very lucky in that sense. There probably are that you sound very much like a hybrid in terms of your deep technical background, but then veering over more towards the business and the commercial aspects, and therefore having that ability to bridge the two realms of business and technical, which I think is highly important for a CDO. I've met CDOs that aren't like that because they are first generation and they've, as you are, but they've not necessarily had that deep technical background. I don't think it hinders them because they shape people around them. But tell me a little bit about the people around you, the structure, and how that works for you. How have you built your team up within Alexander Forbes?
I think, you know, the first thing for me was to obviously try and ensure that there is value in investing in you know, sort of like focus in data. So my first point of call was like a dotted line to say, okay, look, we've got existing people in the organization. By that I mean you've got database administrators, you've got architects at your disposal, you've got business analysts at your disposal, there's project managers. So you've got to sort of like build a sort of like a dotted line team to say, let me first of all get people on the same page, because before you actually go and propose a structure, you've got to, I think, test out a few theories to say, if I work with an architect and focus on the following, can I get business on board? Do I need the business? I mean, I think it's more about the focus areas. I built my team based on the competencies that are currently in the organization.
Okay, so it sounds... Yeah. Go on, sorry, carry on.
Just to make sure that, you know, to kick off this project, I've got to actually get a lot of people on the journey, take people on the journey with me, and at the same time showing them that this is where we're going, without getting people wondering, what are you doing, you know?
So it sounds like you looked internally first and then looked at the competencies across the business, because no doubt there are pockets. I mean, I find that lots of companies are siloed in their approach to data. Some departments are doing very good stuff, some departments not so. So it sounds like you went across the company first, had a look, assessed the skill base, and then started to build a team and bring it together, either in a central fashion or sort of could have still been a hub and spoke model, which allowed you then to build this matrix organization, it sounds like, around you. And I think that helped you permeate across the organization and get your message out probably as well.
Yes, and I think one important aspect, which I feel maybe there's not a lot of focus, is if you think about data operations, for instance. I mean, traditionally you will see database administrators sitting within maybe IT, and, you know, I mean, there's a whole model. For me, I think it's more about also reshaping the model of how we approach data. If you look at the Chief Data Officer office, for instance, I think for me a big focus area is also your data operations, to now sort of maybe change the scope of what DVAs do to sort of fit in with the transformation that is currently happening now. There needs to be more, I think, reskilling, just like every other role, to reskill and position them in such a way that now database administration will be taken to another level. But it also supports the data life cycle in terms of how the data is ingested and how it's also taken out of the organization.
I think that's quite a key insight actually for me, because you know what that sounds like is it's just not only reskilling, but it's moving with the times and the technology and the way that you want to go faster in terms of agility and speed to market. So it sounds like you're building a team which have the right level of competencies, but equally, you know, for example, if you're doing some machine learning and you want to get the algorithm into production quickly, you've got to change your process. You've got to get that DevOps, or people are calling it data ops now, into sync. It's got to be a completely different framework to get that. And probably a DBA or a sysadmin isn't going to help you. But that's interesting. So you've upskilled, you've reskilled people to ensure that they've got those competencies that then gel as a team. And probably brought people from the outside as well, no doubt.
Yeah, true. And just to get back to the one point where I said one of the reasons why I focused internally, because remember when you're looking at the governance organization itself, it's made up of internal people, right? So stewardship in itself is a challenge if you approach it, if you don't approach it correctly.
Correct,
because to formulate the policies, to formulate the frameworks, you need to consult across the group. So involving them in that process is one of the reasons why I actually focused on the internal people first, because then that helps you to shape things and they can actually see their work, to say this is what we've done. When you implement, there's also that level of comfort that, I was part of that, I understand it and I know why.
Well, you've built your champions then. You've built those people who would go and be your influencers, and then spread your message and convert others who might not be there with them or quick enough to grasp what's going on. And I think culturally that's probably with governance one of the biggest issues that we deal with day to day with companies that we work with. Just to come back to, before we get on to the next question, just to come back to something, how have you changed and looked at culture? Because governance does strike culture. So I'd really like to understand how you've been able to view and adapt and possibly not conform, but contribute in a way that data does change cultures. Although we are all, I hasten to use the word data-driven culture. We're all using data to make decisions every day. But how have you worked that through from a cultural perspective?
I think if you look at culture, it also depends on where the organization is at. Like with my current situation, look, the common thing, everybody's in agreement that data is important and we need to manage it. But the process on how you go about that may differ, because remember, what may be of business value to a business, when you look at it in terms of from data, say, look at it from an IT perspective, you just say, okay, it's data, you need it for this, for that. But in an actual business unit, it drives value. It's actually linked to metrics. It's actually linked to, sort of the bottom, the bottom line, in terms of revenue generation. So I think, the culture there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, because you can win the first battle to say, guys, we need to understand the principles. Let's change our way of thinking. I think that's one aspect. Taking it to the next level in terms of, okay, we now got a grip on our control. How do we now utilize it? I think that's the next culture change level. So for me, there's levels.
Yes.
There's one of saying, let's initiate. Once we're all on the same page, what is the next phase? It's almost like intermediate, to say, guys, this is where we are, that's where we were. What do we need to do now? I think it makes it easier as you transition through the levels. So, and I can see it already working in terms of, where we're going. So that's my view, that the culture also has a maturity level. So you've got to gauge based on where you are now and what you're
it's interesting. I think you can almost map data maturity and cultural maturity in some ways. If you look at the models that are out there and some of the frameworks, you're always, as you said, going to use some kind of initiation. You're going to build up to some, level 1 of maturity and so on. But you can almost see a cycle of education, implementation, learning, testing, failing, and then that cycle creates actually it reduces a lot of the cultural barriers between departments, between people, between thinking. And once they start, I think it's the business outcomes. Once the business outcomes, people can see that those are being achieved, and those goals, not so huge and large, but you're achieving them in iterative, smaller chunks, but being able to tangibly show that. I think that's a highly important aspect of what you do as a chief data officer, in my opinion. I don't know if that reflects the way that it sounds like it reflects the way that you've been positioning yourself and the team within Alexander Forbes.
Definitely. Yeah, I think we are aligned in that way of thinking.
Yeah. So let's go on to the next question, because I'm looking at my clock, and we could talk about culture all day. So in terms of leadership, I always want to sort of pinpoint, maybe the top 3, maybe you've got more, but as a chief data officer, what do you think are the most important facets of a chief data officer to achieve? One, from a leadership capability, maybe in the C-suite, but also downward and across to other teams. What do you think you're the best characteristics? There's budding chief data officers on the call. So I'm just interested to hear your view on that.
I think for me, right at the top is the strategic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Is right at the top for me for 2 reasons. One, you've got to understand, what is actually at your disposal and how you're going to put these things together or position based on the common process that everybody knows: people, process, technology. You've got to have that strategic view of,
sure,
this is the business. How do these things fit in, and how can I, from a data perspective, position and maybe possibly support these initiatives? That's the first thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that the second one is the leadership around that.
Yep.
It's almost like you're going to dive into a pool full of sharks.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to know how to navigate your way. I mean, you're not always successful, but I mean, when you fail, you must reflect back and find a way of how you resolve that. So I think that leadership also has to come with resilience, in terms of you've got to have a thick skin and not be, despondent when you fail, and just learn from it, and then find a way to reposition the same proposition and maybe align it with something that can resonate with with your stakeholders. And then I think the last one, but not least, it's more about your technological understanding as well as the the communication skills.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think those are important. Yeah. I've got this view in my head of you swimming with sharks right now.
Well, the fact that I'm still alive, it means I survived.
Which is good. You did. You navigated those waters very well, obviously. But I do like that. It's the strategic objectives, and I think that's absolutely clear. Being able to look at that and view it and understand where the company's going, and where the organization's headed, and why they're headed in that way is fundamental. The swimming with sharks, that navigation, that's a huge big piece that I think lots of chief data officers have to deal with. In particular, first generation, because first generation have to do a lot more work, a lot more effort, a lot more education, and a lot more testing and learning, and unfortunately a lot more failing, because you probably don't have the budgets that are available that maybe the next generation will, who come in and sweep in and have this huge amount of cash, because the first generation have been able to achieve something tangibly, but kind of that I think it goes back to your resilience bit, that swimming with sharks. They thought, I think I'm getting too many bites now. And I need to move on. But on that note, let's look at things. Looking at the CDO role, looking at all that we've spoken about, AI, digital, machine learning, what kind of trend or behavior or technology for the CDO is most going to affect their role? What do you think is the next wave?
I think for me, firstly, Samir, I think I mentioned it before that the CDO role is a transform. It actually transforms, depending on where the organization is at and where you are. So once you've done a piece of work, you've got to think ahead to say what's the next thing. So for me, it's artificial intelligence. I mean, we all know that. Look, it's actually a big piece that is actually driving a lot of innovation across different industries. So I think for me that is a key area. Where data will be used to solve most problems, if not all.
And I was at what they call last week. It's called Commission. It's a big technical conference. I would say AI conference. All things AI, machine learning. But I'd like to bring that point to you. AI. I think that there was a guy called Manoj Saxena who was at CogX last week, who was the first guy who put together Watson and drove that for IBM, and now he's got his own company. But AI, in practical terms, is not really being used. I think I want to bust a myth here, and possibly let's talk about it. But I want to rein it back to machine learning and where we are within the sphere of data maturity and the component of AI, which is machine learning. I think that's where we are in terms of what we're doing. But effectively, we've got better algorithms, more the ability to create those much quicker, and the ability to predict much quicker because the technology has got a lot better, faster, and the capabilities around technology have helped us to get to those predictions and what I would term prescriptive analytics. If you could, what's the example for you in terms of AI that you are currently doing, or is it actually machine learning?
Well, look, right now there's a couple of initiatives. If I tell you, I'll have to kill you.
Yes,
so,
yes, of course. Of course. Thankfully, I'm miles away from you.
I think there's a couple of sort of like POCs that we're trying, we're running to say based on where we want to go with AI. There's nothing concrete yet, but it's things that are actually work in progress. I mean, for instance, you could look at typical example like a claims form, that talks to how you interact with the customer. What is your overall experience, and all those kind of things. We're looking at that from that perspective. But I'm also looking at AI in terms of governance. You roll out a governance program. You also roll out the functional areas like your data quality, your MDM, and all those components. You've got to look in terms of how do you actually spread this type of innovation across evenly and see what leverage you get from each, maybe say domain, and how you put these together to generate value. Because I think that's more around creativity, being artistic, using AI.
It's an interesting point. With AI or with any, machine learning, we're constantly told that are the removal of the human being in terms of a black box and the output from the algorithm makes us less creative and less imaginative. Doesn't sound like it sounds like from what you said, the creativity aspect is actually something that you said on, which resonates with me, because I think as fundamentally as human beings, we're not going to be removed from our jobs. We're not going to be, AI isn't going to take over. Well, that's what I feel. And fundamentally, I think we will go back to being more creative and thinking imaginatively about what we need to do and how we need to embed and create better algorithms that are going to do have less bias, create better decisions, understand why they've created those decisions. And I think currently there's an ethical conversation around those areas. What's your thoughts on those specific areas around bias ethics?
I think I lost you. Can you please repeat that question because you lost audio? Yeah.
Oh, did you? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. So let's do this quick. In terms of the from your perspective, the technical perspective and the algorithmic perspective, we're fundamentally creating black box algorithms where they are going to spit out decisions, but there's going to be a lot of issues with that, ethical bias issues. Why did the algorithm make a decision? How are you, or what are you doing to look at that? And how are you fighting the idea, or what frameworks are you using to ensure that bias is kept at bay, if possible, and to ensure the right decisions are being made?
I think firstly, let me just say that I think we are almost being annihilated by the robots. But I say that if you look at the cognitive technologies, I mean, they're almost like, based on the human's brain ability to learn, and decompose information and get to some sort of inference of some sort. So I think, in my view, regardless of all these technologies that are coming into place, it means now we actually need to look at the concepts of stewardship to say, how do we now align them with the technology advancements that we're facing, and reskill and reposition ourselves, or maybe what our role as humans is. I think that's more. I think that's more the position I would take, to say I would look at that and say, okay, if this is what is replacing from a human aspect, you cannot totally replace a human. There is areas where you face those kind of issues. So you've got to find a balance based on what was the role the human was playing, and what is the role artificial intelligence playing now. And how do I now complement and support to ensure that, things like ethics, how do I address that? So there's going to be, I think, common themes that come out of those technologies, and the challenges that will need to be also solved by humans, while maybe in the background, the clever guys will be working out, the next phase of how do we replace the humans?
How do we replace the humans? How do they take over? Yeah. Let's go back to not such a deep conversation around replacing humans, but as many companies across the world are thinking about the chief data officer and data and looking at becoming and leveraging data in a better way, what advice would you give them as they start to think about hiring for the chief data officer?
I think firstly, it starts off with being, educated by the current challenges. I mean, I think we spoke earlier about the reasons why sometimes, we face this challenge in organizations. Firstly, people don't understand it. There's no budget allocation. You don't have enough resources. I would actually strongly urge anyone who wants to be a CDO that in any interview that is sit in, get clear clarity on what is it that is expected of the role, firstly, and then also understand, challenge them and ask them, okay, what sort of support can I get, from the C-suite, the executives? And where are we in terms of the data journey, and what are the expectations? Expectations can also be, almost impossible to achieve. So you fail before you even start the job. So we've got to get an understanding of the organization itself. Do they understand why they need a chief data officer in the first place?
Yes, yeah. And it's not just about the hiring.
Once you understand that, then as a chief data officer, depending on your skill level, you can then navigate and then maybe expand on what they believe that's to be your role. Because then that's where you show the value that, okay, you hired somebody who's a central mind and who's an SME in that area. But clarity begins with the organization itself. Why do you need a chief data officer?
No, it's a good point. And I think, I think the why is always the biggest thing with organizations. I think I've seen a lot where chief data officers have struggled when they've come in, they've failed. And I think it goes on to the next question around our good old buddy Gartner, that big oracle in the sky, predicts that 50% of a point, of those CDOs in their role will fail in their journey. It seems a bit big to me. It seems like you've done pretty well swimming with the sharks and being able to navigate that, and gone beyond that first generation. And it sounds like you're going into the next iteration of your role, and specifically driving data across the organization to implement those areas that you were talking about, customer experience, driving growth, and so on. But what are your reflections on that, on what Gartner states? Do you think that's a true reality?
I think it's true, but I think going forward that number will drop. And my view being that obviously the first generation CDOs will learn their mistakes and then actually understand why they're failing, and also know that your next gig, when you go to the next gig, you actually know you have some sort of repertoire that you've built, and you can actually walk in and you can tell them, look, for this program to work, this is what I need. You actually cannot argue with you've done it, and you understand that yes, they need to be localized to your new environment. But the principle remains the same. You need resources, you need buy-in, and you need you need to have some sort of mandate coming from the highest office in the organization to be able to carry it out.
And on that point, do you think the CDO, whether they be like you're a group CDO, so it sounds you're very much, I believe, reporting into the CEO, but CDOs typically when they come in, and possibly I believe where this might be coming from is where they haven't reported to the the CEO, and they've reported to other C-suite. What's your view of where the CDO should be sitting in that C-suite, and where do you think the CDO is going after the C-suite?
I think, in my view, there's different views, or maybe different angles you can look at it. If somebody in an organization truly believes they need a CDO, you'll most probably find 99% of the time the person who raises that request is the one that you report to. But I think, in my view, it needs to be in an area where most probably reporting into the CEO, because remember, to drive transformation, similarly, finance, if you look at finance reports directly into the CEO. If
Correct.
you look at HR, it reports directly into the CEO. I mean, all these other, functional areas, within the business, they need to report into the CEO, because why? The focus on data is still a new concept in many organizations. So to shape it, you need that level of authority, or maybe the big stick per se, to say, we are going to focus on our data, that is the mandate. So automatically, you can drive the buy-in, to the other executives, I believe. And then I think that's, for me, CEO is the next one.
Is the right place. And after this, let's think about you, Group CDO. Where do you go from here? Do you transcend to the board level? Do you think that there is a space at the board for the CDO, particularly when data is becoming so crucial in the development of an organization?
I think for me the next level is, and I believe that CDOs, as they mature, they should actually transition into board level, and I'll tell you why. Because remember, if you are going to capitalize, on data opportunities, to create competitive advantage in the organization, you need to actually drive data-driven projects.
Yes.
But in order for you to do that, you actually need to also understand, in terms of at board level, what is their expectation? Because remember, you're trying to manage the expectations of, the whole organization. At board level, what are their expectations? At Group EC, what are their expectations? And at divisional level, what are the expectations? I think those components inform, and actually maybe kind of accelerate your creativity to say, I understand what the expectation is at the top. I understand what the expectation is at the level below that, and then as the organization overall. So I do believe it should be at board.
Okay, so the CDO up at the board level. On that note, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over to some of the questions. I believe we've had some come through, and we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I know we started late, but I'm just going to have a look at what those are. Right, let's see what they are. So, Right. Okay. Within 3 years, when do you consider yourself successful as a CDO?
Look, I think I've achieved a level of success because in that, well, for me, it's actually a year. If I look back in terms of foundation, I'm busy implementation. I believe, yes, I've achieved a level of success because I can now refer back to the foundation, which now guides, my implementation. So I do believe, yes,
Okay. I've got a question here about AI. How do you think AI will affect the insurance and investment management market?
I think there's going to be a lot of, machine learning in that area in terms of, algorithms that will be required, to predict, in terms of, what is the next level of investment based on someone's profile, understanding, I think there's a whole lot. You can link customer insights into that same investment component as well. So in insurance, claims, there's going to be a big impact on that. Pricing, I think there's going to be a very big component, along those lines as well. But overall, the way you engage with the customer, for me, is actually where the biggest impact is.
Yeah, and I think that's where your market stands, really, isn't it? Because I can understand. I think there's a lot of in the insurance market. There's obviously a lot of things that have got to be adapted from the point of policies and claims, and just linking those two together, and making sure that the sales guys understand when policies are maturing, or when they're ending, and if there's a claim going on, and how those two come together. I've seen that be quite a barrier in insurance organizations, where one doesn't sort of speak to the other, and they've gone off and done separate things. I'm sure it's not like that in your market and in Alexander Forbes, but perhaps we can get cuter with that, and machine learning can help generate and drive some of those actions and decisions based on things that are happening across those departments. So I think AI will essentially bring more together and connect more of the dots between departments to ensure that nothing slips through the cracks when somebody has made a claim and suddenly they're being sold a new premium, but they're being sold a premium at a less rate or whatever that might be. So I think that there's use cases there that might help, because I sounds like claims is a big area for you.
And I think also, if you think about the different types of data that we now ingest and need to manipulate, I think for me that brings in a very big component in terms of opportunities for driving new business value, if you understand. Yes. So I think that for me is a key area as well.
So just one thing on that, and I think we'll conclude after that. What kind of external types of data are you using across your business now to support your internal data?
Well, we currently in the process of looking at social media, looking at unstructured data, which I believe also it's something that was not really nobody really actually delved into it that much, but seeing that our customers are in the social media spaces,
sure,
it's an area that we actually also looking into. It's part of our strategy, actually.
Yeah. No, it makes absolute sense. Raymond, thank you very much for your time this morning. I hope that you've had a good session. I've been able to get some really great insight from you, and hopefully the people on the call have as well. I'd just like to thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Your final words.
I think for me, firstly, thank you, Samir. It was quite an interesting conversation. But I think overall, a CDO is actually positioned well now in terms of, what we do with data. It's just a question of, I think CDOs across the world should collaborate and, look at the next level to say, let's review our progress and see what are the next things that we should focus on as CDOs, so that the message is across, the message is consistent, which also will address the issue of people not understanding in the different industries what the CDO is meant to do.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, thank you very much. And for my next session, we will have Sudeep Tiwari from Camden Council, and that will be in the next 2 weeks. Thank you very much, Raymond, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.